All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to R.C.C. Roundtable. Today we are going to be talking about something really important that I feel like a lot of us are having to deal with right now. We're going to be talking about navigating triggers and PTSD. And I feel like with this year, with how much we've had to be in isolation, not to mention just like being completely immersed in social media all the time, and just feeling like there's a constant outpouring of bad news. I know a lot of us have been having a really difficult time dealing with our emotions and feelings, and there are some things that happen that have caused us to have heightened emotions or kind of send us into a panic and anxiety. And today we want to talk about why that is, what causes that, and how you can work through it. My name is Hilary. I'm with Lifelines Counseling Services, and I'm in the Rape Crisis Division.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Kelsey Bryant. I am the Prevention Education Coordinator with Lifelines Counseling Services.
And I'm Laura Anderson. I'm also with Lifelines as a therapist.
Hi, I'm Anja, and I do victim advocacy with Lifelines.
So thank you so much for being here with us today. So like always, we're just going to jump on in. So ladies, what is a trigger? What is a trigger? For those of us who need to know. Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Sure. It can be anything that kind of brings you back to a trauma you've experienced. So anything that reminds you, like triggers can be internal. So maybe a memory that you have or a sensation that you have, or it can be an external thing, like you drive down the street where your trauma occurred, or you hear a song on the radio. They can look a lot of different ways, but anything that kind of brings you back to that trauma memory.
Yeah. I had a good friend one time that experienced trauma, and it was a smell that kind of brought her back to that, a smell. I've even heard some people talk of like songs, like a particular song that could trigger them. So a lot of different, like you said, it could look a lot of different ways.
Watching a movie that maybe has something that happened similar to what occurred, for you, or I mean, it could be lots of different things for sure.
Right. Anybody else have anything else to add before we kind of move on?
I was looking some stuff up this morning, and they just going off of that, there's like sounds like yelling or sirens or visual cues, like certain colors, or if it's an anniversary of the trauma, so it can just be a whole bunch of different things.
Yeah, anniversaries are huge. I know in the time that I've been doing this work, we've got several crisis calls from individuals that were experiencing anniversaries of traumas. And again, those traumas, it could be sexual assault, it could be domestic violence, it could be even like a robbery or some type of traumatic event. So, a broad range of different things.
Yeah, I think it's also important to add that triggers can happen very, very suddenly without any warning. They can be very unpredictable, very random. I feel like sometimes you might be triggered by things and you not even realize what it is that's triggering you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we know that some individuals after traumatic experiences experience PTSD. And I know for most people, when they hear PTSD, they kind of associate that with like war or people that are in a certain branch of the military. But I know Hilary can attest to this too, and Anja, and Laura, everybody, that, our victims, our sexual assault victims also experience PTSD. Can you guys tell us a little bit more about what PTSD is?
I guess I'll jump in. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric diagnosis, and it can apply to anyone that's experienced any major trauma. So, I mean, I've had clients tell me, well, I'm not a soldier, so I can't have PTSD. And I'm like, oh, no, yes, you can. You had a trauma happen. It could be a major accident. It could be natural disaster, like Hurricane Sally. If a tree just came through your living room and almost landed on your head, that's traumatic. So things like that get stored in the brain and in the body as trauma. And if you don't process through those things, process through that trauma, it can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And that diagnosis is, in the DSM, it's like 4 pages long. There's a lot of symptoms of PTSD, but kind of broadly, to kind of categorize it, you're going to see negative alterations in mood. So things like depression, anxiety, panic, anxiety disorders or attacks can happen. Not very good with stress, things like that. Mood dysregulation. You could have things like negative thoughts and feelings, arousal, reactive symptoms. So that would be your trigger. Feeling like reactive. If someone touches your shoulder and you flinch and you start to feel panicky, that's being triggered, but that's a symptom of PTSD. Avoiding those triggers intentionally. So maybe if you're driving, 20 minutes out of your way to get to work because you don't want to pass the house where you were assaulted, that's that avoidance piece. And people will do that a lot with PTSD. Also having intrusive thoughts. So like if those flashbacks are happening, unbidden, or if you're having nightmares or re-experiencing things like that, all of that kind of falls under that PTSD heading or diagnosis.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And would it also be fair to say that PTSD is more persistent than, say, a trigger? A trigger would be more momentary and something that you just kind of have to get through in the moment, whereas PTSD is more long-lasting?
For sure. Yeah. So when you look at trauma, acute trauma disorder is what we give, a diagnosis we give when something's been 30 days or sooner. So if you're less than 30 days out from your trauma, then it's considered acute trauma disorder. That same range of symptoms. But when you get past the 30-day point, okay, I'm still having flashbacks, I'm still having these issues, they can last a lifetime. You could experience triggers like that for years and years and years. And if you don't ever resolve that, that is PTSD. I've had clients who are in their 40s and they're like, well, surely this thing that happened to me when I was a kid isn't still impacting me now.
Oh,
but
yeah.
it is. It really can be. And PTSD can go on for years and years untreated. So definitely, Hilary, you're right on track with that.
Yeah, I really feel like, some of the people that may not really know how to help those individuals, I really feel like they, just get over it. They feel like, you should just be over it. Like you said, your client, something that happened in adolescence, now they're 40 years old and it's still, affecting them.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
it's not something that you just wake up one morning and it just magically disappears. It doesn't happen like that. So would you guys say that there's a difference between triggers and flashbacks? Would you say that there is a difference between those two?
I don't want to keep jumping in, so if
No,
anyone
keep
else
jumping in.
wants
It's
to talk.
fine. It's fine. Just keep jumping in.
So the way that I understand it, the trigger is kind of like the match that lights the fire of the flashback. So maybe the trigger is the touch or the smell or the sound, like Anja was talking about, the song or the color. But then the flashback is the re-experiencing of the trauma that happens afterwards. So, for some people, it's going to run like a video in their mind. Like every detail of what happened to them is happening over again in their brain. That's what a flashback is. And so you can see, like just thinking about that, how it's just constantly traumatizing for the body, and it's keeping people in this elevated level of stress all the time. They're like in fight or flight all the time because they're never really safe. They never feel safe if they're constantly re-experiencing their trauma over and over again.
That makes perfect sense. Can you just come on every week? Can we just do this all over again?
I will say,
really, how you explain that really makes a lot of sense.
PTSD was really kind of one of my areas of interest in graduate school. So I actually have a whole PowerPoint. So you picked the right topic. Yeah.
Is there any way to even prepare for a trigger or a flashback? I mean, can you mentally or physically prepare for those kinds of things? What do you think? What do y'all think? Because when it happens, you know, it's not like you know it's going to happen. So is there a way that you can kind of build yourself up to prepare for when it does happen?
Well, one way that I know, or something that I've noticed an increase in within the past couple of years, are people putting like trigger warnings and content warnings on things, which is really, really, really great. So anytime there's going to be a discussion or a video or something like that, just a disclaimer at the beginning saying, hey, this is what is going to be discussed in this, just to kind of give people a heads up so that they can prepare for it, or if they choose not to read it or walk away from it, they're able to make that decision for themselves. So I think one way would definitely be on the lookout for those trigger and content warnings, because those will kind of give you that flag like, hey, you might read something upsetting or you might see something upsetting in this. So just, you know, be prepared for it. So I think that's definitely one way.
Okay. Yeah.
I think knowing what your triggers are too. I mean, if you're hearing this today and you're thinking, oh man, you know, whenever I do hear that song or whenever I do, you know, drive past that place, it does cause that for me. Knowing what your triggers are so that you can try to prepare yourself. Like Hilary said, they're not predictable always, but most people have patterns of what's going to be triggering for them. And so the better you can prepare yourself as far as like some of the coping skills that we use to treat PTSD, you know, you can utilize those in the moment. So deep breathing, journaling, taking some time out to distract yourself, or, you know, knowing that it's coming is part of the battle. So someone that's having anxiety attacks, for example, you know, that first symptom that comes up, maybe it's the tightness in your chest, or maybe it's the warmth in your face. As soon as you feel that thing, you need to go to your coping skills. What am I going to do when I feel that first little thing so that I can de-escalate my nervous system before I'm in a full-blown attack? You know, and because once you're there, it's really hard to dial it back. But once you're aware of what your triggers are, you can try to catch it like right as soon as it's happening so that you can kind of down-regulate your response.
Yeah, you just definitely just touched on our next point. Just, you know, when you're in crisis, okay, what do I do now? Because like you said, once you're in the middle of it, you know, it's hard to get out of it. And sometimes it can be absolutely debilitating. You know, some people have had panic attacks where they just literally were just debilitated at that moment. And it seems like it hits at the most inopportune time. Like, you know, when you're on your way to something very important, like an important presentation or a job interview or a test, you know, or something like that. And I can see how at that moment, it's like, oh no, here it comes. And, you know, what do I do now? So like you said, deep breathing, journaling, you know, so you have to find what works for you. And I think some people, you know, kind of want a list, but, you know, you really, everything is not going to work for everyone. So you have to find what works for you.
I think it's also very important to know your support system, and that needs to be the support system that you pick for yourself, not what anybody else tells you your support system is. It needs to be somebody that you feel comfortable and safe with. It needs to be somebody that you can have these conversations and discussions with, and then lean on them when it gets to that point. If you need to walk away and call somebody and just be like, hey, I need you to talk to me for a couple minutes and help talk me down. And also knowing your resources, knowing that there's crisis lines available, so that if you're not able to reach out to your friends or family members, there are still people that can talk with you and help get you through that moment of crisis.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a great coping skill, is your support system. And that's, I mean, there's going to be a certain number of people that hopefully you can call anytime you need, you know, someone to help talk you down. And kind of figuring out what does work for you. Because like you said, y'all said, you know, not everything's going to work for everybody. So for some clients, you know, a meditative practice or deep breathing could be triggering for them. You know, maybe that brings back, like just being quiet with their own thoughts brings back some of the traumatic memories. So maybe that's not for them. Maybe they need to put on loud music and dance. Maybe they need to switch it up, you know, do something totally different. And that's okay, but kind of figuring out what works for you ahead of time so that when you're in that moment, like you said, you know what to call on, you know what to pull out, and start trying, you know, to see what's going to work for you in that moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what if it's not you that's in the moment? Maybe it's a friend or a loved one. How would you ladies suggest that you help someone that is in crisis at the moment? Because, it can be very different from a client or, a survivor that you're working with. What if it's a sister or a friend or, or a brother or someone that is very near and dear to you? How would we help those loved ones? What do y'all think?
Just meeting people where they are. And if that means, okay, we're going to sit here and just take some deep breaths together, or do you need to cry it out and vent? And I listen, knowing that your role in that situation isn't to fix things or to change what happened to them, because you can't. It's literally just to be a support to them and whatever they need. So, if it's someone that you know really well and you kind of know what their coping skills are, then maybe you remind them in that moment. Like, hey, you said last week that, deep breathing's really been working for you. So let's sit here and take some breaths together. Or, I know you love going for walks. Let's go for a walk. Like, let's get up. Let's go move our bodies. Knowing what helps other people, it helps us to be a better friend or a better sister, or, kind of learning what's going to work for them, and then reminding them of those things when they're in crisis, so they don't feel alone. And if they're in that activated spot, they may not remember what works. If you're in the middle of a panic attack, you might not have the logical thought, hey, I should stop and take some deep breaths right now. You might need someone to remind you, and then you'll be there, once you've got that little nudge. So
yeah, I think that's awesome. That's really good. Anja, do you have anything to add to that, of how you would possibly maybe help a friend or a loved one who is literally in crisis at that moment?
It might help if they do have a mental health professional, to maybe they've had help from them in identifying triggers and coping skills that work for them. So if they do have a list of those coping skills, maybe you can kind of go through those, or contact, if the situation is more of a crisis situation, contact the appropriate hotlines if that's necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just knowing those resources sometimes is a huge help. It's a crisis line. If you feel like maybe, at that moment you just really don't know how to personally help them, reaching out to individuals or agencies that do that, that's awesome. That's always a help. So if you don't know what to do, reach out to someone who does.
Yeah, definitely. And as I was preparing for today's discussion, something that I really want to start doing with my friends from now on is, whenever we're just like hanging out, talking and having conversation, I really want to start asking them, like, hey, do you ever feel triggered by stuff? Like, if so, is there anything that I can do for you in that moment? Just so I know, if that ever arises, we'll have already had that conversation, and I'll, try my best to remember what they said, so that I'm able to help them. Also, I think another thing that a friend or a loved one can do for somebody who might be experiencing a trigger is intervening if possible. For example, let's say they're in a situation where somebody is just making really hurtful jokes, or maybe it's just like a very heated discussion where they're talking about topics that are like very personal to somebody. Maybe intervening and helping change the subject, or be like, you know what, let's stop talking about this, or can you stop making those jokes? It's not funny. Just advocating for your friend, letting them know that they have somebody there who has their back and can support them. And also, another thing that you can do for your friend in those situations is asking them pointed questions. I think not only does it kind of help distract from the situation, but not always when people are in a moment of crisis, if they're having difficulty breathing or a racing heartbeat, they're not going to be able to give very long explanations and be able to pinpoint everything that's right. But if you ask pointed questions where they can answer with a yes or no, like, hey, can I get you something to drink? Do you want to leave? Do you want to walk away from here? Do you want me to call someone for you? Can I hold your hand? Can I give you a hug? That sort of thing. I think that also shows a great amount of support in those situations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Laurie, like you were about to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just love that point that Hilary made. And I think that's so important, especially when you're dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, because one of the things you see a lot is people aren't able to advocate for themselves when they're in that elevated, that aroused state, because really the brain is, if you're in fight or flight, you're not forming complete thoughts. Like your brain is not functioning up here. So you really need a voice. You need someone to stand up for you in that moment and say, okay, this is getting out of hand, guys. You know, we need to dial this back. Like, and so I think that's a great point, that we all should be doing for each other, PTSD or not, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Just forming those support systems that, you know, like whatever the situation may be, they'll be able to come through for you.
Yes.
And I think that's very, very important, because I know, you know, whether it's professionally or personally, all of us have been affected some way by these triggers, flashbacks, PTSD, all of it. So that's
and
great.
especially, I think especially with the election coming up, with the debates and everything, there's so many topics that get discussed, and just, I don't know, let's say you've personally been affected by sexual violence or something, hearing it debated on whether you deserve services or whether you deserve this or that, just hearing that can be very triggering as well. And something that I saw that I thought was really interesting whenever I was reading about triggers and flashbacks is whenever you're in that moment of crisis and it kind of takes you back to that moment of trauma, your body and your mind is not remembering it as a past event. In that moment, it still thinks that it is a present, imminent threat, which can cause all those like escalated heart rates and sweaty palms and difficulty breathing, and feeling that immediate need to respond or react in that situation. And I thought that was really interesting, because I'd never thought about it that way before. It's just whenever it takes you back, it's no longer in the past. You're back in that moment again.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
That's a really good point. And I think we see that too, you know, keeping in mind like how PTSD looks in children or adolescents. It might look like oppositional defiant disorder. It might look like an attachment disorder, because there's anger, there's irritability, because these kids are like hyper aroused all the time. Because you're right, Hilary, they don't feel safe. So, you know, taking into account, hey, this child has a trauma history. What can I do in my classroom so that they feel safe here? You know, so that they don't, because you can't learn if you're in that state of being hyper aroused. So all those things, like keeping in account how many people have experienced trauma, it's a horrifying statistic of people, you know, that have experienced it.
Yeah.
So if someone's acting off or angry or irritable, like changing that narrative of what's wrong with them to what happened to that person, like considering their history and maybe what's going on with them that they haven't dealt with, and responding appropriately, you know, can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything, ladies. Yeah, absolutely.
And I would also just like to add, I know, I mean, I've seen people joke about it before, that like about people getting triggered. And I want to make it very clear that triggers are by no means a sign of weakness. No. People are just really cruel and really mean. You do not ever have to feel guilty about feeling triggered or experiencing PTSD or flashbacks. And also, it's important for you to know that you have permission to walk away from situations. You have permission to turn off the news. You have permission to turn off your phone. You do not have to know everything all the time, especially at the cost of your well-being. So please have grace with yourself and give yourself permission to walk away and say enough is enough.
Preach, Hilary.
Great closing statements. I really wish we could hear from our audience right now, but well, you know, technology, that's just what happens, you know, and things look so different right now. We're just happy to be able to share, you know, these ideas and thoughts and everything. So thank you again, ladies, Anja and Laura, for joining us today. We are so grateful. So we greatly appreciate all of your, you know, your wisdom and your insights. Does anybody have any other words of wisdom before we sign off?
I just want to say really quickly, if you're hearing yourself in some of these things we've talked about and you haven't sought treatment for your trauma, I really encourage you to do that. Seek out a mental health professional, because PTSD typically doesn't just resolve itself.
Right.
You know, it could continue for a lifetime. So, I mean, if any of this is ringing a bell for you and you're like, hold on, you know, seek out some help. It really can make a world of difference, and get those coping skills in order. Figure out what you need to do so that you're not re-experiencing this for the rest of your life. Once was enough.
Absolutely. Yes. Couldn't have said it better, Laura. Absolutely.
But yeah, hopefully we're going to have Facebook Live working by next week. One of our awesome counselors, Belle, sent some really, really great graphics or infographics about PTSD and triggers. So once I get this uploaded, I'm going to put those in the comment box for everybody to check out.
Yay, thank you, Belle.
Yes, thank you so much, Belle. And I also want to say, if you are struggling, if you or somebody you know has been affected by sexual violence, or if you just need help, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us 24/7 at 251-473-7273, and that is our 24/7 crisis line number.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you, ladies, for stopping by to, you know, just to join in and talk about these difficult topics, but definitely necessary things that we need to talk about. So, all right, to everyone who will view this, we'll thank you so much for viewing, and we will see you again next week. Same time, different topic.
Yes. Thank y'all so much.
Y'all
Have a great day.
Y'all too.
Bye.
Bye.